Okay, we're going to go ahead and get this started. Thank you everyone for joining us for ALSN's first webinar. Today's topic is exploring the relationship among nurse manager competence, practice environment, and patient outcomes. Leading this webinar is ALSN President Nora Warshawski. Nora, you are welcome to begin your webinar.
Oh, thank you, Kristen, and welcome to the participants. And so let's get started. If you were at the INARC conference last November, you had an opportunity to hear this live, but if not, this is a great opportunity to catch the details of the work. So I wanted to start by a few acknowledgments. The statistical analysis for all of this work is done by Emily Kramer, and she's a research associate professor at the University of Kansas School of Nursing, and she works with all of the NDNQI data, and she's just brilliant. This study was funded by the Versant Center for the Advancement of Nursing and the AONE, now AONL Foundation. Participants were recruited and through the use of a partnership with Preskini for the study, and of course they allowed us to use the NDNQI data, although they do not claim responsibility for the results of my analysis. So anyway, let's dive right in here. Right now we are seeing 70,000 baby boomers retiring every year, and with that comes the loss of nursing leadership wisdom. And really what we need to be mindful of is that we are replacing experienced nurse managers with novice nurse managers. Nurse managers have really a critical role on nursing units. You all know that. They are responsible for creating the positive practice environments that lead to the positive nurse outcomes. And as a result of nurses being more satisfied, generally we see a trend to have higher patient satisfaction as well. So what is nurse manager competence? Usually when we hire nurse managers, we hire them for their clinical expertise. But that's a little bit different from the skills that are needed to manage a unit. We've made recommendations for graduate education, and we've made recommendations for formal succession planning, yet still the literature says that they're really learning through trial by fire. You know, it's just thrown in on the job and expected to learn through experience. Some hospitals, organizations have leadership development programs, and these include combinations of didactic material, experiential projects, coaching and mentoring. Some have used reflective practice, collaborative learning, and one study talked about a 3-month trial management period at the end. But one of the leading hallmarks of these programs has been the ability to engage in confidential learning. And the outcomes range from increased content knowledge of the nurse manager participant, increased self-confidence, decreased vacancy rates, established resource networks, and they've also, in some studies, reported an increased prestige associated with the nurse manager role. But all of those studies really have focused on the immediate nurse manager outcomes. So all related to either the program or things that the nurse manager could assess. And for this study, we wanted to look beyond that. We wanted to see how does nurse manager competence influence nurse and patient outcomes. And so our conceptual framework guiding this study was that nurse manager competence directly influences patient outcomes, and nurse manager competence in combination with the practice environment of nurses creates positive patient outcomes. To do this study, we recruited participant hospitals through Press Genie. We sent an email out to about 300 hospitals who were eligible and invited them to join the study. We had 150 respond, which was twice the max of what we could enroll in the study. So in the end, we enrolled 80 and 53 followed through with the data collection. That gave us 647 nurse managers representing 954 patient care units, which is a really sizable sample for a nurse manager study. The data were collected in October of 2017, and the RN survey data that we matched our nurse manager survey to were collected throughout 2017. So the hallmark of this study is that we surveyed nurse managers, and then we asked them for their identifier code so that we could link their survey data to their unit level RN survey data. So this really is an innovative design for nurse manager research. Let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of the hospitals. For the most part, the hospitals were around 200 beds, and then most of them were either magnet or pathway recognized, with a few that were applicants. And then we did have 32% of the hospitals who were neither magnet or pathway recognized, and they were not seeking. The sample of nurse managers were still predominantly white female. Nice data on the education levels. We're now up to almost 62% BSN educated, and 39% had a graduate degree. 15% were certified with a leadership certification, and those were we gave them the options between the two certifications offered through AONE and the two certifications offered through ANCC. Still running about 45 years old. Years of experience as a nurse manager, 6.73 years. Years in their current position, 4.14. This suggests that they are changing positions somewhere right around the 2-year mark. They are still managing large spans of the controls. They have, on average, 66 FTEs. If you look at the pie chart on the right side of the screen, you'll see that I color-coded these based on experience level. So just about 37% have less than 2 years of experience. Another almost 22% have between 2 and 4 years of experience. So that's 59% of this sample has less than 4 years of experience. That's going to be an important thing to remember as I go through the competency levels. And then 40%, at least 40% who have 5 or more years of experience as a nurse manager. The nurses that were included in these samples were heavily white female. 67% had a BSN, so that's a good rate there. 24% had a specialty certification, and they were about 38 years old with 12 years of practice, and on average 6 in their current unit. Now, to conduct this study, I needed to come up with a measure for nurse manager competence. And I chose to look at the AONE nurse manager learning domain and learning domain framework. According to this framework, nurse managers have to have competencies in 3 domains. The science domains are called managing the business. These consist of things like finance, strategic planning, performance improvement, technology, and I think clinical competency clinical competency even falls in this domain. The second domain is the art of leadership. These are the soft skills, the relational skills, things like human resource leadership, relational management and influencing behaviors, diversity, shared decision making. And the final category is the leader within. And this is how the nurse managers view their professional roles and responsibilities. So are they members of professional organizations? Are they working on graduate education? And are they planning, future career paths? If you look at the tool that AONE provides for nurse manager competency assessment, it consists of probably about 100 line items to assess. They really get down to the detail level. The beauty of that tool is that it's developed based on a national level review of job descriptions of nurse managers, and it's updated routinely. So in order to make this a manageable tool for research purposes, I created a reduced version. I paired items together that seemed that had common foundation to create a new item that reflected different components that they had listed individually. So I reduced this down to a 27-item tool. The art of management subscale had 9 items, and the science had 18. So here's an example of what I did. In the AONE financial management competency domain, they included the items that you see on the left side of the screen, recognizing the impact of reimbursement on revenue, anticipating the effects of changes on reimbursement programs for patient care, maximizing care efficiency and throughput, understanding the relationship between value-based purchasing and quality outcomes with revenue and reimbursement. I took those 4 items and created the item that you see in red on the right, knowledge of healthcare economics and its application to the delivery of patient care. The second item that I created was to reflect the financial management subscale was knowledge of the unit and departmental budgeting processes, both capital and operational. And it was to reflect all of the competencies that you see on the left side of the screen related to creating, monitoring, and analyzing a budget, being able to monitor for ongoing productivity, being able to forecast future revenue and expenses, and to be able to create a capital budget. I didn't create any items for the leader within domain, just the art and the science subscales. The reason I did that was because I had other items within the survey to look at personal development strategies, career planning, reflective practice, and journaling. So what I chose to focus on out of that domain was to look at certification and education. The second scale that we use, this came from the nurse survey, the practice environment scale of the nurse work index. So these items were reported by the clinical nurses. They were aggregated at the unit level. And so I think most of you are probably familiar with this tool, consists of 31 items, 5 subscales looking at the quality of care, the foundations for quality care, participation in hospital decision-making, the quality of the nurse manager, adequacy of staffing and resources, and the collegial relationship between nurses and physicians. There are 4 response options that range from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Oh, and there's the subscale that I just went through. And then to reflect patient outcomes, we use 2 items from the nurse survey. The first being missed care, and the second one being a question that asks nurses to rate the overall quality of care. And here's what we found. Nurse managers rated their competency levels basically on average around 3.5. 3.4 for the managing the business science domain, and 3.6 for the art of management domain. When we looked at the science of management domain by individual category, the categories that make up the science of management, we found a range from just shy of competent level. The financial management was rated lowest, and strategic management came in second, with performance improvement third, just over the 3.0 range. And on the upper end, the 2 highest rated competencies were clinical practice and technology. And when you think about nurse managers entering into the role, they are hired for their clinical expertise, which these days does include a lot of technology skills. So to see technology and clinical practice as the highest rated skills was not surprising for us. The art of management categories were rated well into the 3.0. In fact, if you look at the diversity management, it's almost at the proficient level. And those, I think, are nurses' strengths. We come in and develop strong communication and relational skills as clinical nurses at the bedside. When we looked at nurse manager competency by years of nurse manager experience, we broke it out. We broke out those same, the 2 subscales and total scale score. We looked at those with 2 years or less than 2 years of experience, They rated themselves as well over competent, but then between 2 and 5 years, those scores dropped to just under competent. I think this might reflect the fact that they're changing jobs in that time period. I'm not sure, I'm not positive, but based on the experience as a nurse manager and experience in their role, it seems a logical connection. But then they pop back up by year 5. Their their competency levels have increased, and by year 7, the art of management subscale is just reaching the proficient stage, but the science and the total remain below the proficient level. And then we started to look at the bivariate relationship. We looked at correlations among competency and various role preparation strategies. And what you'll see, the correlations that we have on the scale, on the slide, they're all significant with the exception of those in red. So nurse manager experience was not correlated with the PES NWI total scale score. and nursing education, highest degree of nursing education, interestingly, was not correlated with certification, nor was certification correlated with graduate education in leadership specifically. What we can learn from this slide, though, is that there were moderate to strong correlations between nursing education and graduate education. So many of these, remember, 39% had a graduate degree and 60% had a bachelor's degree in nursing. And so there's a strong correlation there. Competency and nurse manager experience was the strongest correlation. So if you look at the nurse manager correlation with the science and art, they were 0.46 and 0.41 Pearson correlation relationship. And then there was a positive relationship between competency and graduate education at 0.29 and 0.21, and competency and nursing education was just a little bit lower at 0.23 and 0.16. What that tells me is that nurse manager experience has twice the effect of graduate education. The practice environment scale of the Nurse Work Index scores are here on the slide. These are unit level scores. RN participation and adequate staffing were at the lower end of the scores, whereas collegial nurse-physician relationships was at the top. And the nurse manager ability, leadership, and support subscale was in the middle. The quality of care rating score was 3.52 on a 5-point scale, and the missed care score was 1.82. This question asks nurses to identify among 16 routine nursing care procedures, how many of those items were missed on the last shift worked. And so they check off anywhere from 1 to 16 items. The average score for this analysis, for these units in this analysis, was 1.82, with a standard deviation of 1.5. When we put all of this together in our mediation model, we found significant relationship between nurse manager competency and the practice environment and the quality of care rating. And then we also found that nurse manager competency through the practice environment also reduced scores of missed care. So those were the significant relationships. We did not find a direct effect of nurse manager competency on either quality of care or missed care. But nurse manager competency in combination with the practice environment influenced the outcomes of quality and missed care. So what did we learn from this? There was a lot, I thought, to take away from this. 62% reported BSN as their highest nursing degree, and about 40% reported that they held a graduate leadership degree. So I think that our education level of nurse managers is increasing when you look back, to 2008 National Sample Survey data. So this is good news. 60% of the nurse managers had less than 4 years of management experience. This is a shift. In my previous studies, it was more likely the reverse, that we had only 40% with that little experience in nursing management. I think that's a reflection of the fact that we have nurses leaving the leadership positions. They're probably retiring. And we still find that on average, nurse managers are changing jobs after the first 2 years. This number's come down somewhat since my last study and significantly from my 2011 data. So they're not the same sample, so you can't, they're not directly comparable, but just the trends going from having that first job gap of being 5 years of experience, and then it went to about 2.7, and now we're at about 2.4 years. So it's reducing in tenure. So what did we learn about competency? We learned that the art skills are scored higher than the science skills. The science skills, if you think about it, are really pretty important skills for organizational performance. The art skills are probably more important to clinical nurses, but to the organizational performance, the science skills are really what we need to develop. On average, nurse managers reported being competent in their first 2 years, and that competency level drops at 2 years of experience, and that might be due to changing positions. I find it fascinating that nurse managers leave one nurse manager job to take another so quickly. It's at a 2-year mark. And so that's a future study for me somewhere. Nurse managers that have 7 years of experience report almost being proficient. I find that a little concerning given how important nurse managers are to healthcare, to the healthcare system. I think that by 7 years, they should be feeling proficient. They should be feeling expert. And so I wonder about why they're not reaching these higher levels of expertise. Nurse manager competency was correlated most strongly with nurse manager experience, followed by graduate leadership education, followed by the highest nursing education. We did not see a direct effect of nurse manager competency on either miscare or quality of care, but there was an indirect effect of nurse manager competency through the practice environment on both of our outcomes. So when you think about the nurse manager and what a nurse manager's job entails, this kind of makes sense. A nurse manager creates the environment in which nurses practice, and then it is the nurses themselves who deliver the care. And so to see this relationship it affirms, what we assume to be the pattern. What does this mean for nurse leaders? I'm not sure how many on the call are nurse leaders versus researchers versus educators, so I think I have a little something for everyone. So the first question, if I were a nurse executive, would be to ask, what's my collective nurse manager talent pool look like? Do I have a very experienced seasoned crew all getting ready to step off into retirement? Or do I have a very novice crew that needs a lot of coaching and mentoring, or am I somewhere in between? I think that's important to understand. I think that we need to recognize that experience is an inefficient way to learn how to be a nurse manager. It's certainly insufficient to develop nurse manager competencies. We can strengthen nurse manager role transition by requiring graduate leadership education. We could provide a formal mentoring program. We can offer nurse manager residency programs. We could create personal development plans, and we can develop formal succession plans. Those are all reported and described in the literature. If you wanted to reduce nurse manager turnover in the first place, which is, one of the precursors for having a novice level staff, of course, you really can't do much about retirements. When people are ready to retire, that's really within their purview, but you might be able to tap into them as a resource to provide mentorship to new nurse managers. But when you can reduce nurse manager turnover, it might be due to the practice environment. And so there might be opportunities to look at how you as a leader create an environment to support nurse managers. The work that I've done, I've found that the most important part of nurse manager job satisfaction derives from their ability to work with their nurses, their nursing team. So creating strategies for nurse managers to have time on their units is very important. The second common predictor for nurse managers and their workload is their satisfaction with their work environment is their workload. So that means how many units do they have to be responsible for? How many FTEs are they leading? 66 FTEs is a lot, and the average was 1.5 nursing units. So that means we have a sizable portion of our nurse managers managing more than one unit. The relationship that the nurse manager has with their director is very important. A lot of nurse managers see that as a mentoring and coaching relationship rather than being dictated to or micromanaged. That's what they're looking for. And then what's the overall organizational culture? Is there a strong sense of patient safety, patient advocacy? In other words, is patient care job one in your organization? Education. We probably have a few educators on the call, and so I wanted to put in a plug for nursing administration programs. I do believe that this study demonstrates that there is some connection between graduate education and leadership and patient outcomes, nurse manager competency. I think the fact that we don't have a large percentage, a large proportion who have graduate education demonstrates that there's opportunities for us to grow more graduate prepared nurse managers. We definitely need them to learn how to manage the business, how to improve processes, how to develop strategic planning objectives. So very important content that they can learn through graduate nursing administration programs. And then because nurse managers do learn through experience, programs should include an experiential learning component. And research. So intervention studies. We need to understand what are organizations doing to try to improve the work for nurse managers, the work environment, how are they promoting their competency, how are they trying to accelerate that competency. I think we need to develop, replicate, and test the effectiveness of nurse manager residency programs. There are a few national level programs that, not necessarily residency programs, but AONE has a number of programs such as the Emerging Nurse Leader and the Nurse Manager Fellowship. And so how are those helping nurse managers transition into their role? And then how can you take the learnings from the people you send to those programs and leverage that in the organization to develop others? We certainly need to test the effectiveness of our education programs on clinical practice. It's not enough just to say that, yes, we provide the skills if it's not having valuable impact on actual practice. And then strong program evaluation design. What is the impact on nurse and patient outcomes? So much of the research, the evidence on leadership development, because I get it, I understand it, it's easy to do, to look at how education is impacting the actual participant. But in reality, in order to develop that business case, that return on investment, you need to be able to take it another step further. You need to be able to look at how is it impacting nurse turnover, nurse satisfaction, nurse retention, and the patient outcomes. Those are sensitive indicators. So in conclusion, nurse managers are critical to organizational success. They do not possess the competencies when they're first hired. They need a supportive role transition. Nurse manager experience needs to be augmented with structured role development strategies. Graduate leadership education, formal mentoring, and succession planning are recommended strategies to accelerate that competency development. So, are there any questions from the audience? I think that you can type message questions into the group chat box, and we can answer them for you. Well, I have a question for you all if you don't have one for me. So, what are you all seeing in terms of practices for onboarding nurse managers in your organization? Okay, have a new message. No formal structure. Okay. Oh, I see. What are the recommendations for starting a development program, knowing that most managers will leave after about 2 years? Well, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things you have to think about is what happens if they don't leave, number one. Do you really want to have somebody that does not have a lot of experience in such an important role? But I do believe that it's important to make sure that they have the foundational skills that they need to do the job. If you are hiring people into a role that do not have the skills and abilities, then you really are kind of obligated to make sure that they develop them. Otherwise, you'll be responsible for the outcomes of that practice. So one thing you could do is to require graduate education as a requirement for the position. So as a way of knowing that they have the experience that they need to take the role. And then one of our participants asked, why are nurse managers not getting an advanced degree? I think that's a great question to ask. I think that some of the answers for that are that nurse managers are still paying off other undergraduate loans. They have children they're putting through college, or their lives are just really busy. I think it goes back to some of those, routine reasons that we see for people not getting a bachelor's degree. And that's the other thing, do they have a bachelor's degree? We only saw that 2/3 of our sample had a bachelor's degree. So if they don't have a bachelor's degree, then that's a bigger hurdle to overcome. Organizations have cut back on some of the funding for supporting education. So it presents a financial burden for organizations, for nurses to go back to school if they don't have the financial support, if they don't have the personal resources, or they're not getting it from their organization. So all good questions. Any other questions from the audience? Last week I was at the AONE meeting, and we had a discussion group on this topic, and a lot of conversation evolved around having mentors. Nurse managers would like to have a formal mentor program, and specific education around finance and performance improvement. They asked for toolkits. Trying to think what else. They wanted to have programs that provided mentorship over the period of a year, 3 months to a year. I have a new question that wanted to know, did I look at nurse manager job satisfaction related to the competencies? No, I have not. I looked at, I just published, an article just came out that covers most of this analysis, was just published electronic ahead of print on Jonah, but no, we haven't looked at job satisfaction yet of nurse managers. We're in the process of getting ready to start those analyses. Other questions? Would you consider examining outcomes from NDNQI versus using self-reported patient outcomes? Press-Ganey could provide. That's what we used. We used the NDNQI survey data, the nurse survey data. Those questions that nurses answer about patient outcomes. So but we did not have the data on falls, pressure ulcers. We haven't done that yet. We have access to that data. The challenge is that because you have to look at outcomes that are consistently associated with unit type. So, for instance, in order to look at falls and pressure ulcers, we would only really be able to compare it amongst managers of med-surg units, say. We'd have to, because the expected rates would be different for critical care units. It is something that I'd like to try to look at, but the first level of data was to look at the stuff that we knew we could look at across the entire group, because that's the strength of this study, is to be able to look at outcomes that are associated with all 647 nurse managers that we had. But those are great questions. You're right. Those are really good questions.
Do we have any other questions for Nora? We still have about 15 more minutes of webinar time.
Okay, what do you recommend as the first focus? evaluating span of control, or adjusting or instituting a leader development program. I think that's an and. I hate to say that. So if you have a lot of vacancies, part of the reason you may have vacancies in nurse managers positions, if you have a difficult time recruiting into nurse manager positions, may be because the role is unattractive, unappealing. And so having large spans of control when folks, really would like to have a life outside of work as well as having a job that they find challenging and rewarding, still needs to be manageable. And the two things that make the job manageable for nurse managers is, one, to have a span of control that they can manage, and two, to be competent in their position. And I know it comes down to money for organizations. And so it is a challenging balancing act. One participant has asked, what's the work on optimal span of control? I've looked at that. I've not published that data. I've looked at that in two previous data sets. And in one data set, it looked like the optimal span of control for job satisfaction is the outcome, not tied to nurse or patient outcomes, but for a nurse manager's job satisfaction. In one data set, the magic number was right around 53. In another data set, this was the first one was a data set of 25 hospitals. And then in a second data set, it was one health system. So it was about 5 hospitals in one health system. And in that case, the magic number was closer to 45. But that was just for looking at nurse manager satisfaction with their work environment. So I don't have that same level of analysis done looking at nurses' span of control. Span of control outside of nursing, I haven't done a search of that literature recently. I'll be getting there soon. Leadership positions, they report on span of control for, I've seen reports of just, like 10. I haven't seen the same kinds of numbers that nursing experiences. There's a whole host of research questions related to span of control, and that will be probably the focus of a future study. I'll be able to scratch out some, with the current data sets that I have, I can start to look at some of that data. In a previous, in my 2012 data set, I was able to look at span of control a little bit and job supports, because it's not just the numbers of FTEs that you have, it's the number of FTEs offset by the number of units you have, offset by support roles and support functions, so there's kind of a counterbalance to those. I think it'd be a great study for somebody to take on and really, get down into the weeds of it. But I haven't done that yet. I've just done some surface level analysis. In looking at my research associated with nurse manager job satisfaction, does flex time come up? Let me see. I think, in the comments that participants provide, sometimes they talk about being able to have a flex time as something that's a satisfier for them. But I haven't studied that specifically. In my new data set that I I did include a measure of, I asked about the number of work hours in a week, number of calls that they take at home, and I have a subscale in there that asks them to evaluate the spillover effect from work onto family life. And that data is all being analyzed now, or starting to be analyzed. I have a doctoral student who's getting ready to graduate. They're finishing their PhD, who used that for her dissertation. I have a colleague here at UCF who also is interested in work-life balance and work demands. And so she's going to be looking at a piece of that data as well. But yeah, there's a lot that could impact job satisfaction and plans to stay in their positions. So, good question. You're all budding researchers, I see, or experienced researchers. Your research suggests the need for graduate level education. However, the scope and standards for nursing talk about BSN, suggesting that core competencies require graduate work. Do you know there will be support to change to graduate level as entry to practice? I don't think you'll find a lot of support for graduate education as entry to nursing practice, but perhaps entry to nursing management practice. I really would hope that we could get to that point. I believe that it's an important step that needs to happen in practice. I think there are going to be challenges for that. Certainly, being able to recruit nurses with graduate education has always been, I think, the top barrier. But you know, this may be the time, you know, with the overall gradual upscaling of education. So I think it's not out of the realm of possibility, but I think what we're more likely to see at this point is bringing somebody in with a bachelor's degree with the expectation that they complete a master's degree within a certain number of years of taking the position. I think that may be the way to go about it. What percentages of nurse managers' time should be devoted to coaching, mentoring staff, and others? Well, the number one predictor of nurse manager job satisfaction across the board, and the number one predictor of nurses' satisfaction across the board, is the amount of time that nurse managers have to spend with them working on patient care issues on the unit. The second most important subscale to outcomes was the ability of nurse managers to have time to coach and develop their staff. So I would say that, well, actually that was the ability of nurse managers to work with their staff, was to coach and develop staff. That was an important satisfier for nurse managers. So when the top two issues are both involved, the amount of time that nurse managers work with staff directly, I think it'd be important for them to have meaningful time to connect. And so all of my studies, the comments around, there are always comments around the amount of time nurse managers are away from the unit, working on projects, system level issues. Those are really important for nurse managers to be involved in. I think that the question is, what's the right balance? So I think you're onto something by asking that question, the percent of their time that they should be devoted to coaching and mentoring their staff. It's probably their most important function, especially given the novice nature of our current nursing workforce. You know, we're going to be bringing in more and more with less and less experience because of the retirement. So it's a critical function. We probably have time for one more question. Is there another question out there? And on cue, there you go. Now that we have graduate level nursing degrees in nursing leadership, do you see future recommendations for graduate level education to be nursing specific? I mean, an MBA rather than an MBA or MHCA. Okay, so my evidence, we included all of those in the pot. So when I said graduate leadership education, it included a mix of those with MSNs, MBAs, and MHAs. And I didn't differentiate amongst them because I don't think there's enough data in there. But I think that that it would be nice to see specific to nursing master's degrees because there's important skill sets in there, but a case can be made that an MBA would be equally beneficial or an MHA. Somebody else asked about the executive DMP. So here's the advantage for getting a master's in nursing leadership. When you get a master's in nursing leadership, you have clinical hours attached with it. And so when you want to then go on to the executive DMP route, maybe a few years down the road, you already have a foundation of clinical hours. We take people who have master's degrees in business administration and healthcare administration into our DMP programs, but then they also have to complete the full 1,000 hours of clinical experience that in that executive DMP program. So that requirement was set by AACN, and so all programs have to comply and set the expectation for all of their students. So if you have a master's degree in nursing leadership, you probably already have some clinical hours, whereas if you don't, then you have to make them all up when you move on to the DMP. There is currently no financial reward in most organizations to have a DMP at a manager level. So I have seen students complete our program who were nurse managers, and they stayed as nurse managers when they finished, and they had no pay differential. The advantage to them came, though, when they were looking to move up the ladder and the career opportunity was available. They were positioned to be able to be more competitive because they had already completed their DMP. So those are my thoughts on education. And it looks like we are at the end of our hour. Kristen, is there anything specific that they need to do to claim their CE? I'm not sure what that is.
I have the people who have purchased this webinar, and they will receive a certificate for the one contact hour. And just as a reminder, this will be edited, and we will put this on the ALSN website as an on-demand function where you can go out there and purchase it as a member for $25 or $35 respectively for a non-member. If any of these individuals on the call would like a request for the slides, please reach out to myself or Nora individually.
I appreciate you all tuning in for the webinar. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.